gonna give the West a helping hand. I'm gonna spell out what are the Russian conditions for moving on with a ceasefire and then with possibly a peace treaty. So the West now has no more excuses for not understanding what the Russians want. And we're gonna go through all of that. And then we have the green t-shirt who's just going back to his old tactics. And that is to play NATO against Russia by tickling NATO's ego. And it works. And then we have Friedrich Merz, who just like a superstar, keeps the front page of every media outlet for a few days now. And for all the wrong reasons, of course. The only other character who came even remotely close to dethrone Mr. Merz from the front pages was Mr. Emmanuel Macron, our dear friend Emmanuel. But even he has failed because Friedrich Merz, he really wants to be on the front pages. I mean, the statements that he makes. But nevertheless, enough waffle, let us go to Ukrainska Pravda, the beacon of democracy, your favorite propaganda outlet, and let's begin with Mr. Lavrov. Russian Foreign Minister reveals Moscow's demands for next round of talks with Ukraine. Quote, at these talks on the 16th of May in Istanbul, we insisted on the repeal of these discriminatory laws, such as restricting the Russian language, and we will continue to do so in the next round of direct talks, which we will announce in the near future. So is this something that the West had no idea about? Well, of course not, because the language problem in Ukraine has been going on since 2014, and it became very clear in black and white in 2019, when it was actually passed as law. And let's keep something in mind. This is not just a Russian problem. This is also a Hungarian problem, and Romanian problem, and Polish problem. It didn't just affect the Russian minorities, it affected all minorities. But the reason for why the Russians have been up in arms about it is for obvious reasons. The Russian minority is the biggest minority in Ukraine. Let's move on. Lavrov said that one of the conditions for ending the war for the Kremlin is also the neutral, non-aligned, non-nuclear status of Ukraine. Quote, I have said many times that the trigger for the conflict in Ukraine and more broadly the deep security crisis in Europe was precisely NATO's aggressive expansion eastward over many years, he said. So is Mr. Lavrov wrong? Well, of course not, because since 1991 it was the West's policy to keep expanding NATO closer and closer to the Russian border, because the West has always operated under the assumption that the Russians will never push back, their economy is not big enough to sustain a war, we can do whatever we want, and if we cannot defeat Russia on the battlefield, then we will surely sink Russia's economy. Sanctions. This was planned since the very beginning, except the plan has failed, because they have underestimated the strength not just of the Russian economy, but also of the Russian military, and also they have massively overestimated the power of the Western economies. Nevertheless, what Mr. Lavrov is saying is that these are the things we want. We don't want any language problems in Ukraine. We don't want Ukraine to join the NATO alliance or any other alliance. It needs to be a neutral state on the Russian border. And then third, no nuclear status. Is this so difficult? Well, according to the West and according to the green t-shirt, this is impossible, because nobody can dictate to NATO what NATO can do. Of course, that's not true, because there's one principle which exists that's called the principle of indivisible security, which clearly states that one state cannot expand and improve their security on the expense of another state. It's very simple. If Ukraine joins the NATO alliance, which is an alliance dedicated to fighting against Russia, well, in that case, this jeopardizes Russia's national security. But who cares about that, right? The only security that we care about, and we've been trained to care about, is of course the US national security. That's sacrosanct. But Russia's, who cares, right? Let's move on. No NATO expansion and lifting of sanctions, Reuters reports on Putin's conditions for peace. Russia also wants Ukraine to be neutral, some Western sanctions against Russia to be lifted, the issue of frozen Russian sovereign assets in the West to be resolved, and protection for the Russian speakers in Ukraine. One of Reuters' sources stressed that if Putin realizes that he cannot achieve a peace agreement on his terms, he will try to show Ukrainians and Europeans through military victories that peace tomorrow will be even more painful. Just for clarity, these Reuters sources that they mention apparently are all officials of the Kremlin. So take that for what you will. But what they're saying is not wrong, because this is exactly what Vladimir Putin said after the green t-shirt has abandoned the talks in Istanbul in 2022. He actually put out a message at the time, most of you would remember, and he said, the peace which will be on the table in the future, whenever you decide to come back to the table, Mr. Green T-shirt, is gonna be a little bit more painful than it is now. And then he repeated the same message last year, I think it was on the 6th of June, or on the 14th of June, when the Swiss Peace Summit took place. Vladimir Putin said the same exact thing again. The more time goes on, the more losses we suffer, the harder the peace is going to become in the future. The more painful for Ukraine and Europe, of course. And now they're saying, well, this is a revelation. No, this is what Vladimir Putin stated since minute one. And basically, the message is reiterating exactly what Mr. Lavrov said just a few minutes ago. These sort of statements could also be seen as the Kremlin speaking through multiple voices, hoping that the message will eventually trickle down to NATO, just so they have a better understanding of what the Russians really think. Now let's carry on to the next and last paragraph of this article. NATO has also stated in the past that it will not change its open door policy simply because Moscow demands it. And that right there is the very reason for why I keep saying that the West has absolutely no respect for Russia. This is the Western hubris talking. We can't do something just because Moscow demands it. Well, how about you do that for your own good? If not because of Moscow demands it, then why don't you do it for your own safety? Because you would think, right, logically speaking, that it would also be better for NATO to keep a certain buffer zone between them and Russia, since Russia is their designated enemy. Public enemy number one. Why wouldn't you want a buffer zone? Unless what you're trying to cause is not peace. Let's just say that. Now let's move on to Mr. Green T-shirt. Zelensky, if Ukraine is not invited to NATO summit, it's victory over NATO for Putin. Quote, what matters is Ukraine's participation and the outcome of its participation in this summit. In my opinion, if Ukraine is not present at the NATO summit, it will be a victory for Putin, not over Ukraine, but over NATO. Therefore, the decision is up to our partner, Zelensky said. This is the most basic instigating tactic there is in the world. Basically, the green t-shirt is saying to NATO, look, if you allow this bad man in the Kremlin to keep munching over Ukraine, this will not just reflect badly on me, but also on you, because you're supposed to be my protector. This sounds so silly, but what's even crazier is the fact that these tactics actually work, because the Western leaders, they're also very concerned with the optics. What would people think? Well, we can't allow ourselves to look weak. That's what they think. They think they look weak by being rational. So the green t-shirt does the smart thing. He's actually trying to play on their ego, because their ego is far, far bigger than their competence. This is why these tactics work all the time, every time. Germany vows to block Nord Stream 2 and weaken Russia's military machine. It's not Germany who vows that, it's Friedrich Merz, just to be specific. Merz stressed that the large-scale air attacks on Kiev that occurred at the weekend do not speak the language of peace but the language of war, of course. Quote, this is a slap in the face of all of those fighting for a ceasefire in Ukraine, in Europe and in the United States. Therefore, we will increase pressure on Russia, Merz asserted. So Mr. Merz, who's presiding over a declining economy with very little prospect to ever get back on track, at least at this pace, he wants to damage Russia. He wants to weaken Russia. Well, go figure. Also, let's not forget that just a few days ago, Mr. Merz made some incredible statements stating that now the Western countries, France, the UK, Germany and the United States, they have all removed the restrictions, so now Ukraine can launch Western missiles deep inside Russia. He spoke not just for Germany, but for everybody else, because that's what Friedrich Merz does. And immediately, just 2 hours later, members from both the Bundeswehr and the Bundestag, they've stated, hold on a second, this is not true, we have not done such a thing. Because those people understood the implications of what Mr. Merz was saying. It was only Friedrich Merz who did not understand what he was saying. And now he wants to apply even more pressure on Russia. Well, what do you think is gonna be the tactic of choice for Mr. Merz? I'm gonna allow the veil of suspense to just float in the air. Listen to this. He promised to do everything to weaken Moscow's military machine. Quote, "We are also doing this to pave the way for the negotiations. I speak on behalf of Germany. Well, in this regard, we will do everything to ensure that Nord Stream 2 does not work," he concluded. So in other words, the way to get Russia and Ukraine at the negotiating table is by ruining the German economy and by permanently sealing its fate. This is what Mr. Merz is basically saying. We will destroy Nord Stream permanently just to help with the peace process. Does that make sense? Well, maybe not to you, but it certainly does make a lot of sense to Mr. Merz, because that's what he stated. But he also fails to tell us how exactly will the condemnation of the Nord Stream pipeline and the German economy along with it help support the peace process between Russia and Ukraine. This is ludicrous, of course. This is like me saying, look, I'm gonna sacrifice everything I have just so maybe you can suffer a little bit financially. Will that make sense? Will that sound like a rational decision? Well, I think we all know the answer to that. But Mr. Friedrich Merz, he doesn't stop here. Oh, no. He wants to make sure that he stays on that front page. Let me take you to the next article. German Chancellor says supplying Taurus missiles to Ukraine is possible. Asked about supplying Ukraine with Taurus missiles, Merz responded, "Of course, it is within the realms of possibility." But just because it's possible, it doesn't mean it's likely. That's why he's choosing his words very carefully. He says possible. Anything is possible, right? At the same time, he added that this would require several months of training for Ukrainian soldiers. That right there is his way of backtracking what he said a few days ago when he stated that Germany is ready to give Ukraine Taurus missiles and fire them deep inside Russia. This is now Mr. Merz backtracking, and he's saying, well, look, we would want to send all of these missiles, of course, but it's the training that's the one holding us back. So don't expect any Taurus missiles to Ukraine for the next many months because of training. Mr. Merz, wouldn't it be better to not say things which you will then have to backtrack 5 minutes later? I mean, it's just a thought, but what do I know? I'm not a politician, I guess. Speaking about further sanctions against Russia, the Chancellor said, quote, "Everything that can be done on a secure legal basis is possible." I hate to say it, but I do agree with him on this one. Anything is possible in today's Europe, because there's no more common sense, there's no more logic, and there's no more reason. And we have a lot of leaders making decisions which are against their country's core interest, just in order for them specifically to score political points here and there. That's the reality of the situation. So yes, as much as I don't like it, I agree with him. Anything is possible. But my friends, I'm gonna leave this episode here. It was a pleasure as always. Let me know what you think of Mr. Merz in the comments down below, and I'll see you tomorrow. Take care and bye-bye. Hello, my friends. As far as the Russians are concerned, this conflict is not about Donald Trump. It's not about the US, Germany, or Tammy Bruce. This conflict for Russia is about the national security of Russia. This is something that the US should understand very well, because last time an enemy, an adversary, had their missiles close to them, the United States kicked up a huge fuss because they're threatening the security of the United States. Well, it's the same exact thing over there, Donald. It's the same exact thing. Hello my friends and welcome back to the channel. Today is Wednesday, the 28th of May, and this is my only video update of the day. Before we begin, I just want to say a few words. Today marks exactly 1 year since I have posted my first ever video on this channel. And I just wanted to make a video telling you about the journey, about the good, the bad, the ugly of YouTube, and also to show you certain things from behind the scenes. Unfortunately, because my lower back issues are still present and I'm also under treatment, this means I cannot sit down for extended periods of time, which is why you're only getting this one video update a day from me. However, all of this will change starting from next week. I'm gonna go back to the usual routine with 2 video updates, and that also means that this video that I've just talked about, it will get made at some point next week. So watch the space for that one in case you're interested. Now, enough waffle. Ukrainska Pravda over there is getting very angry. It wants to bring you the news and the propaganda, so let's just oblige. But on a serious note, what this video is mostly going to be about is the US position vis-a-vis the conflict in Ukraine. Because with each and every passing day, I think we are getting further and further away from what was promised and closer and closer to what we used to have during the Joe Biden era. So with that said, let us go to Ukrainska Pravda, the beacon of democracy, and let's check out Donald Trump. Trump says Putin is playing with fire. The US president criticized Putin and said that if it weren't for me, lots of really bad things would have already happened to Russia. And I mean really bad. He's playing with fire, Trump noted. Donald Trump should have elaborated on this statement just so we can all understand where he's coming from. Because from my perspective, for Russia, nothing has changed in a tangible way since he came to power. Yes, there is dialogue, which he has promoted. Yes, there are certain negotiations going on behind the scenes, which is great. But the problem is, dialogue and negotiations have to be followed up sooner rather than later by action. And that's the problem. That's where everything just falls apart. The statements he's making sound more like the ones we used to hear during the Joe Biden era. And speaking of the Joe Biden era, have you noticed that the European leaders are just as hawkish today as they were during Joe Biden? In fact, I would argue their rhetoric has gone even higher. And then you get the green t-shirt, who's just as out of control today as he used to be during Joe Biden. So what exactly has changed? Donald Trump seems to think that Vladimir Putin needs to thank him for not having bad things happen to Russia. In what way? What worse can it happen to Russia? There's already over 30,000 sanctions, and as far as tricks up their sleeve, the West has none. They've shown their hand a long time ago. Also want to make another point. During his election campaign, he has made the promise not just to the American people, but to the rest of the world, to a certain extent, of course. And that promise was simple. He said, I'm going to stop this conflict within 24 hours. Now, you know me very well. I did not take that literally, and I said that at the time. I couldn't have imagined that within 24 hours everybody's gonna be happy, people will be singing Kumbaya, holding their hands, and no, of course not, that's just not how things work. But what I was hoping for is that he at least would try to end this in the shortest amount of time. Now let's think about it. What's the only way in which the United States could have stopped this within weeks, or at least a couple of months? Well, the answer is obvious, isn't it? Just stop all support for the green t-shirt. If you really want to stop this, if there's nothing else that interests you, well, that's the only thing you need to do. But of course the US wasn't doing that, they're still not doing it, because there was never any desire. The counter argument is, well, of course not, we can't do that, because the fighting is still going on. Oh, really? Well, on that note, by using the same exact token, why is everybody up in arms when Vladimir Putin launches a missile barrage? Because that's the exact same thing. As long as the fighting goes on, Russia is fighting, just as Ukraine is fighting. But you see, this is why I'm saying that we are getting further and further away from what was promised and closer to what Joe Biden used to do. This is the exact sort of dynamic. This is not the position of a mediator. When you say, I'm not happy with this, I'm not happy with that, this is not about making you happy. This is about the reality of a conflict, which you, as an outsider, need to do your best to understand if you want to be involved with stopping it, of course, because nobody's making you understand it. You can just remove yourself from the situation. To me, this is very hard to understand. Please let me know in the comments below what exactly do you think changed, or maybe nothing has changed. Maybe this was all a smokescreen from the very beginning. I don't know. But let's carry on. US State Department urges Russia to take Trump's sanctions threat seriously. And this comes from Tammy Bruce, State Department spokesperson. Quote, we continue to support direct talks between Russia and Ukraine. The president supports any mechanism that leads to a just, durable and lasting peace. Any mechanism. There is no military solution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and the diplomatic solution is necessary. I would like to know what exactly makes Miss Tammy Bruce think that this conflict has no military solution. I legitimately don't understand where she got that from. But let's move on. She's saying that a diplomatic solution is needed. Well, I fully agree. A diplomatic solution is not only preferable, it is very much needed, Miss Tammy Bruce. But here lies the problem, the huge problem. The Western diplomacy has already failed. That's why we have Russia and Ukraine at war. Because war is what happens when diplomacy fails, Miss Tammy Bruce. But no, she's asking for more of the same, and they're all asking for more of the same. I wonder why is this so hard to understand. As far as the Russians are concerned, this conflict is not about Donald Trump. It's not about the US, Germany, or Tammy Bruce. This conflict for Russia is about the national security of Russia. This is something that the US should understand very well, because last time an enemy, an adversary, had their missiles close to them, the United States kicked up a huge fuss because they're threatening the security of the United States. Well, it's the same exact thing over there, Donald. It's the same exact thing. Former Russian president threatens Trump with World War III, and this comes from Dmitry Medvedev, as suspected. Quote, regarding Trump's words about Putin playing with fire and really bad things happening to Russia, I only know of one really bad thing, World War III. I hope Trump understands this. Dmitry Medvedev is known for making these kind of statements, which is why it's easy for most people to just write him off. Oh yeah, that's what Dmitry Medvedev said. But I think there's far more to this statement than meets the eye. In my opinion, the message he's sending to the White House is this: Russia is prepared for whatever the West has. And now comes the question, what does the West have? Well, outside of the military force, which would mean World War III, which I imagine is not an option, the West only has the sanctions and the tariffs and all that nonsense. But if sanctions is all you have, then you really have nothing. And this has been proved over the last 3.5 years. The sanctions have not worked as they were intended. The Russian economy is still there. Yes, it has a lot of problems, but so does the Western economy. The more pressure they apply on Russia through sanctions, the more the Western economy suffers along with Russia. They're connected far more than people realize. Let's move on. Zelensky, US will not support Ukraine leaving controlled areas. Quote, it doesn't matter what is written in the ultimatums if we are not just talking about a piece of paper, but about something that could lead to the first step, a ceasefire. I think that even at the highest level, the United States will not support Ukraine's withdrawal from the territories that Ukraine currently holds. This is a huge statement if it is indeed true, and that's because what the green t-shirt is saying is that it's the United States who won't allow him to withdraw their troops from Zaporizhia, Kherson, and the rest of Donetsk. This is huge, again, if it is true. It remains to be seen. But if it's true, just imagine the hypocrisy. On the one hand, you get certain people from the West saying, we want peace, we want a ceasefire, any mechanism we would agree. And then you get the green t-shirt saying, well, actually, they're the ones not allowing me to do this. Let's move on. Ukraine needs 30 billion to produce weapons and deter Russia, says Bloomberg. Quote, we are not operating at full capacity, Zelensky said on the 27th of May at a press conference in Kiev. He noted that $30 billion is needed to cover the deficit. He called this amount an approximate estimate of the cost of Ukraine's military objectives. Only 30 billion? Well, that's reassuring. Thank God it's not 100 billion. Who's ready to pony up for the green t-shirt, by the way? Who has his wallet up ready to support the green t-shirt? This is why, my friends, this conflict just won't stop. And that's because there's a lot of money to be made by Western corporations and also by certain Western interests. If this stops, well, the entire grift goes away. And who wants to put a good grift to bed? Nobody. My friends, I'm gonna leave this episode here. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you tomorrow. Take care, and bye-bye. On the one hand, they say to Russia, well, don't worry, Ukraine will never join NATO. But then you see Mr. Brekelman saying, well, no, of course not. We have to push the green t-shirt in at the summit to send the message. These tactics of sending messages have failed utterly for 3.5 years, but they still push on. Then you get Mr. Tsashna who's saying, well, it's in our hands to make this stop. Well, if that's the case, if it's in your hands, then why is this thing not stopped yet? Hello my friends, I hope you're all doing well. Today is Monday, the 26th of May, and this is my only video update of the day. It's a new week and it's supposed to be a new beginning, but we have the same old propaganda from the West. Yesterday, another massive Russian missile attack has taken place over Ukraine, but this time around it has caused certain Western leaders, such as Donald Trump, to say that Vladimir Putin has gone absolutely crazy. He changed apparently. We also have Kit Kellogg, who's all up in arms, saying that this is a violation of the Geneva Convention. And then we also have others, apparently more moderate, who are saying enough is enough, that's it. Confiscate all of the frozen Russian assets right now, because of course that will bring peace about. Oh, there's gonna be so much peace because you confiscate the Russian assets. It's just insane. But then we also have the European leaders who are all scrambling about in Europe, trying to find a way to include the green t-shirt in this NATO's June summit, because of course Ukraine is on an irreversible path to NATO membership. And then, last but not least, I have a treat for you. I've saved this for last, just as a treat. Margus Sashna from Estonia. I think you already know where that one is going. But my friends, let us go to Ukrainska Pravda, the beacon of democracy, and let's start with Donald Trump. Trump, Putin wants all of Ukraine. He has gone absolutely crazy. In his post, Trump noted that he had always had a very good relationship with Putin, but according to him, the Russian leader has changed. I totally agree with you, Donald, 100%, you're totally right. Vladimir Putin has indeed changed. You see, my friends, in his early days as Russian president, Vladimir Putin was actually in favor towards good relations with the West. In fact, he went as far as asking NATO if Russia could join the alliance. How naive looking back, isn't it? But that's exactly how things went. Vladimir Putin's biggest mistake at the time was being too naive and actually believing that good relations can exist between Russia and NATO. But of course that was never possible, because as far as the West was concerned, they never saw Russia as an equal or as a potential partner. Of course not. For the West, then this is important, for the West, Russia served two purposes. Purpose number one, exploit its natural resources as cheaply as humanly possible. And number two, and this is also very important, Russia was always the justification for NATO. If Russia joins the alliance, or if Russia is no longer perceived as a potential enemy, well, in that case, what reason does this alliance have to exist? How can they justify spending so much money and endless wars? Of course, that's no longer possible. This is why, as far as the West was concerned, Russia needed to stay as an enemy. And it took Vladimir Putin a very long time to understand this. But finally the penny dropped. I think it was around 2007. And that's when Vladimir Putin started to change. And then from there, it only got worse for the West, because he saw the West for what it really was. So yes, Donald, I agree, Vladimir Putin has indeed changed. He no longer believes all the nonsense and the lies from the West. Take a look at Minsk II, take a look at so many things. Point being, that's the end result, and Donald Trump is not happy. Trump said that Putin has gone absolutely crazy and is needlessly killing a lot of people, pointing to Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities. The last thing I want to do is to minimize the aftermath of these Russian attacks on Kiev, but I need to show you the next article, but don't worry, we're gonna come back in a second. Russian nighttime attack on Kiev and Cherkasy Oblast. No casualties, but houses, farm buildings and cars damaged. And also pay attention to the date, it's from this very morning. So Donald Trump is saying that Vladimir Putin has gone absolutely crazy and now he's launching indiscriminate attacks on Kiev. But Ukrainska Pravda at the same time is saying no casualties were recorded. Well, where's the disconnect here and what does this tell us? Well, it tells me two things. Number one, those early warning missile systems, which the United States has left behind for the green t-shirt to use, are still working just fine. And the second thing, even more importantly, is the fact that those drones and missiles that the Russians have launched had a military target in mind. That's how you get to launching 300 missiles and drones and still not cause a single casualty. That tells me that probably high precision munitions were used, not intended to cause civilian casualties. And if that was the case, well, the objective has definitely been achieved, because luckily and thankfully no people were hurt. But you see, this is what the West does. They take one of these incidents and use it to ramp up the public opinion against Russia. And it used to work, and it still works just fine to this day. Quote, missiles and drones are being shot into cities in Ukraine for no reason whatsoever. I've always said that he wants all of Ukraine, not just a piece of it. And maybe that's proving to be right, but if he does, it will lead to the downfall of Russia. I guess it's always easier to just point the finger at your opponent rather than admit to your own mistakes, because this conflict has never been about a little bit of Ukraine or all of Ukraine, as Donald Trump seems to suggest. In fact, far from it. This conflict has been about NATO enlargement and NATO's constant wish to push closer and closer to the Russian border. That's what this has been about. And that's the responsibility of the West, of course, because they're the ones controlling NATO. It stands to reason, right? But of course not. It's easier to just blame Russia for everything. What Russia always wanted was for Ukraine to just stay neutral. And if certain people ask, well, why? Well, it's because NATO is not just any military alliance. It's the military alliance that's dedicated, that sole purpose to exist is to fight Russia. And you heard Mr. Jens Stoltenberg and Mark Rutte and every single NATO official talking about war with Russia. So with that in mind, why would Russia want and be happy with Ukraine, their neighbor, at their border, joining NATO? It just doesn't make much sense, does it? But of course, Donald Trump says Vladimir Putin always wanted all of Ukraine. And with that statement, you just wash your hands and put it in a box, right? Nevertheless, Trump did not forget to mention Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, stating that his rhetoric only complicates the situation. Quote, everything out of his mouth causes problems. I don't like it and it better stop, he stressed. I think we all know that that's very unlikely to happen, because for as long as the green t-shirt has the backing of the European leaders, he's not gonna stop. In fact, his rhetoric will only ramp up. So what Donald Trump wants, I think that's just wishful thinking. But let's move on. Trump administration finally responds to large-scale Russian attacks on Ukraine. And this comes from Mr. Keith Kellogg. Kellogg posted a photo of Kiev in flames and stated that such attacks constitute a clear violation of the 1977 Geneva Peace Protocols. Quote, this is Kiev. The indiscriminate killing of women and children at night in their homes is a clear violation of the 1977 Geneva Peace Protocols designed to protect innocents. Quote, these attacks are shameful. Stop the killing. Ceasefire now, he added. And again, I'm gonna flash this article on the screen right here. What these are, my friends, are tactics meant to pressure Russia into accepting whatever the Western conditions are. This is why we see all of them all up in arms at the same time. This has been coordinated, and of course it doesn't stop here. It never does. Let me take you over to the next article. Republican congressman says Ukraine must be armed to the teeth and Russian assets confiscated. Republican Representative Don Bacon, a moderate member of the US House of Representatives, has rejected the idea of peace talks with Russia following Moscow's large-scale weekend attacks on Ukraine and called for decisive action. A moderate, they say. I mean, he's so moderate to the point where he's asking for the same exact things as all of the European leaders, and we know just how moderate those are. They've been telling us since day one of this conflict that this is the way to force Russia into peace. Put up the sanctions, confiscate, arm Ukraine, and everything will be fine. Yet here we are 3.5 years later, nothing has changed. In fact, it only got worse. So these tactics clearly don't work, but we have moderates, such as Mr. Don Bacon, who's advocating for more of this. Exactly like the EU leaders. I'm not even gonna spend any time talking about this, but I just wanted to present it because, well, we wanna see the degree of moderation, right? Organizers looking for ways to include Zelensky in NATO summit program. Ruben Brekelmans, Dutch defense minister, whose country is hosting the June NATO leader summit, has said that Netherlands is looking for ways to include Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the program of the Hague summit. What these people do is they take the biggest root of this conflict, Ukraine's accession to NATO, and then they stir it and ramp it up and stir the pot And then they say, well, we want peace, of course. Well, let me make an analogy. If you have an injury on your hand and you don't want any pain, well, maybe it's best if you don't do this with the injury all day, every day. Maybe, just maybe that way the pain can finally stop. But of course not, they do everything upside down, but they claim that they want a specific result. I think it's obvious by now, 3.5 years in, their policies haven't changed. I'm talking about the West here, of course. Their policies have not changed, there's absolutely no moderation, and there's no willingness to have a proper dialogue, because they need to have their terms imposed, of course, because that's the only way to get peace. Let's move on. Imposed, of course, because there's no willingness to have a proper dialogue, because they need to have their terms imposed, of course, because that's the only way to get peace. Let's move on. Estonia calls for unbearable pressure on Putin after large-scale attack. And this comes from the Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna. Quote, another night of Russia demonstrating its ongoing aim to wipe Ukraine off the map with swarms of drones and missiles, including ballistic ones. Putin continues this until the pressure becomes unbearable. It's in our hands to make him stop. When I see statements like this, I legitimately ask myself, how do the Western leaders see their relation with Russia after this conflict is over? Because one way or another, at some point, this conflict will be over. But what they do and what they say right now, one, does not promote peace in any way, shape or form, and second, it does not pave the way for some sense of normalcy with Russia after this conflict is finished. And these 2 points should be the biggest goals for any diplomat in Europe or in the world today, but specifically in Europe. This begs the question, what do they imagine? How do they see the end of this conflict? Because even if this war in Ukraine would be over tomorrow, would that be something great for the European leaders? Well, unless you promote some sense of normalcy with both Russia and Ukraine, you will not feel that this conflict is over. And maybe it won't, because another one will start unless you change your rhetoric and unless you push these two societies towards some sense of normalcy. But of course, what they say and what they do is the complete opposite. On the one hand, they say to Russia, well, don't worry, Ukraine will never join NATO. But then you see Mr. Brekelman saying, well, no, of course not. We have to push the green t-shirt in at the summit to send the message. These tactics of sending messages have failed utterly for 3.5 years, but they still push on. Then you get Mr. Tsahkna who's saying, well, it's in our hands to make this stop. Well, if that's the case, if it's in your hands, then why is this thing not stopped yet? My friends, I think I'm gonna end the episode here. I feel like I'm slowly going into the rant and I don't want that. So I'm gonna end it here. I wish you a fantastic rest of the day, but I'll see you tomorrow. Take care and bye-bye. All the rest of them said absolutely not. NATO will never negotiate with Russia. Russia doesn't get to dictate what NATO does. Because, NATO exists in a vacuum. But if anybody else on the planet was to adopt the same position, saying, well, NATO is never going to dictate to us, we will actually go in Mexico and create military bases. What would the United States say to that? Well, I imagine nothing good. Hello my friends, I hope you're all doing well. Today is Sunday, the 25th of May, and this is my only video update of the day. Today we're going to discuss the frontline situation in Ukraine just a little bit more than usual, and that's because certain developments have been reported, and spoiler alert, is not looking good for the green t-shirt whatsoever. And after we get through these frontline updates, that's when we're gonna go to the place where we normally go to the political circus and propaganda on the European scene, brought to us by none other than Ukrainska Pravda, the beacon of democracy. We have Mr. Landsbergis from Lithuania, so I think that should give you a pretty good taste of what's to come. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and actually start with what happened last night. One of the biggest Russian aerial attacks has taken place over Ukraine, and it involved more than 350 missiles and drones. And as usual, the Ukrainian media has reported that over 90% of these have actually been downed. This begs a question, a legitimate one. If only 6 to 7% actually managed to get through, then how come that the damage they cause is so catastrophic to the point where the green t-shirt and Mr. Sibia immediately came out and asked for more sanctions on Russia? I mean, that's the default response, No thought given, just put the statement out and hope for the best. But at the same time, what's very important to understand is that a similar attack has taken place over Russia, not involving as many drones and missiles, but still the intention was the exact same. But of course, nobody's really reporting on that, only on what Russia does, because that's exactly how propaganda works. Even though, if you was to go on Ukrainska Pravda, or on the New Voice of Ukraine, or on the million other media outlets, you will see the exact same thing. The Ukrainian army is bolstering about attacking this part in Russia and that plant and this. It's a joy, isn't it? Now, with that said, the green t-shirt and Mr. Sibia immediately came out and said, look, these are not the actions of a country that wants peace. Well, when you have a ceasefire, at that point you can judge what that ceasefire brings you. But up until you get to the point of having a ceasefire, you can't ask for the enemy to behave as if a ceasefire was already in effect, because certainly Ukraine doesn't do that. Nobody ever does. This is not a Russia-Ukraine thing. This is how wars are. Once you enter a ceasefire, that's when you can expect for complete silence to ensue. But up until that point, well, you have to go through the motions, I'm afraid. Now, with that said, let us go to the front line, because there's some developments which have been reported, and it's not a good one. Russians managed to gain foothold in Sumy Oblast, Deep State analysts say. Deep State, a Ukrainian group of military analysts, has reported that Russian forces have managed to gain a foothold in Sumy Oblast along the Veselivka-Zhuravka-Novenke-Basivka section. On its interactive map of hostilities, which I'm going to show you in a minute, Deep State has marked this area as occupied rather than designating it a gray zone. I was actually patiently waiting for them to report on this, because this didn't happen last night, and it did not happen overnight. This has been developing for at least the last 10 days. But it's Deep State, it's Ukraine, so you would have to forgive them for not rushing to report on Russian battlefield successes. But with that said, let me show you the map and maybe we'll understand why the Russians have chosen that exact point. So this is the area we're talking about, and it sits right at the border between Ukraine and Russia. It also must be noted that this was one of the main launch pads for the Green T-shirts Kursk incursion last August. This is why the Russians are now trying to position themselves here and establish what Vladimir Putin has called a buffer zone. Personally, I think that this has everything to do with that buffer zone that the Russians keep talking about. Deep State also reported on Saturday, the 24th of May, that the Russians had advanced near the settlements of Odradne, Troitske, Novenke, Basivka and Zhuravka. Now, Odradne is in Donetsk Oblast, Troitske is in Zaporizhia, Zhuravka is in Sumy. So what's the message here? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? The Russians are advancing all across the line of contact. And maybe this is why, maybe, just maybe, why the green t-shirt has become such a big pacifist ever since the fighting season began in 2025, which was at around mid-March. But this, of course, is not all. Let me take you over to the next article. Kupiansk in Kharkiv Oblast, 90% destroyed or damaged. Situation is critical. And this comes from Andriy Besedin, head of Kupian City Military Administration. Besedin said that the situation in the Kupiansk Hromada is not difficult but critical. The Russians are attacking the central parts of the settlements with guided aerial bombs, artillery, MLRS, and FPV drones. Now, the green t-shirt is going left, right, and center, giving statements and boasting about the high number of FPV drones that Ukraine can produce. Basically, they're saying Ukraine is number one in the world when it comes to drones. Personally, I don't buy into that, but even if that was true, drones do help you defend, that's what drones are best for, but drones do not put you in a position to ever take the initiative. For that, you need the most important resource in any conflict, and that is manpower. And that's the one problem which money from the West cannot solve. It is not a secret that the biggest problem Ukraine has for a number of years now is manpower. And it's not just manpower, because it's not enough to just gobble up people from the street and send them to the front line. It doesn't work that way. They need training, they need rest periods, you need rotation. And that's the area in which the Ukrainian army is suffering. However, my friends, the circus will continue, and I think now we've got to the part where I need to take you to the European scene. Putin remains resolute on victory in Ukraine, US assessment reveals. And this comes from the United States Defense Intelligence Agency. Russian forces continue their gradual advance in Ukraine's east, bolstered by additional troops, including over 10,000 North Korean soldiers deployed in Kursk Oblast to support the offensive. Notice the language. They're saying that the 10,000 North Korean soldiers are supporting the offensive. But in reality, do they? Because if they're deployed in Kursk Oblast, the only purpose those soldiers serve are protecting the border, so that what the green t-shirt did last August would not happen again. It's very simple. But this is how propaganda works. You use words in a very tricky way to try to mislead people. Because most people, especially those who are unfamiliar with the overall situation, would just assume that the 10,000 North Korean soldiers stationed in Kursk will actually emerge into Ukraine, which is not gonna happen. But nevertheless, they're saying that Vladimir Putin is poised on obtaining a military victory in Ukraine. And I think this is the perfect time to define what victory is. Because if we were to listen to all of these Western warmongers, they say that Vladimir Putin wanted to conquer all of Ukraine, which was never true. In fact, Vladimir Putin didn't want to conquer anything. And the biggest proof for that is the negotiations with Ukraine in Istanbul in 2022. Vladimir Putin, Russia, wasn't gonna take any sort of territory. That was about NATO enlargement, it was about the rights of the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine and all of those things. But it was never about territory. The reason they're saying that Vladimir Putin is now poised on military victory is because Vladimir Putin's definition of victory is slightly different. He wants the 4 oblasts plus Crimea, and that would be victory for Russia. Whereas the West, they tried to change the goalpost and redefine Russian objectives. This is why such a big disconnect in terms of what the Russians see as a victory and what the West is saying that the Russian victory would be. That's how propaganda gets fueled. The assessment notes that Putin remains committed to imposing post-war neutrality on Ukraine, limiting its military capabilities and further fragmenting the state. And all of that could have been prevented prior to 2022. I don't know, by NATO not pushing their enlargement to Ukraine, by not organizing a coup in 2014, and there's many examples. Even on the cusp of war, on the 17th of December 2021, 2 months before the invasion happened, NATO had a chance to stop all of that by just addressing the Russian memorandum, which was sent to the White House on the 11th hour. But of course, Jake Sullivan and all the rest of them said absolutely not. NATO will never negotiate with Russia. Russia doesn't get to dictate what NATO does. Because, you know, NATO exists in a vacuum. But if anybody else on the planet was to adopt the same position, saying, well, NATO is never going to dictate to us, we will actually go in Mexico and create military bases. What would the United States say to that? Well, I imagine nothing good. I think nothing good will come of that. Trump ignores Ukraine aid and focuses on Russia reset, MP Serhiy Rachmanin says. Vladimir Putin is absolutely happy Trump does not interfere substantially in the Ukraine conflict. However, Rachmanin said Trump's first 3 months in office yielded nothing but holding aid and exotic ideas. I'm sure statements like this will prompt Donald Trump to support Ukraine massively. I'm sure Donald Trump responds to this kind of tactics, I have no doubt about it. Quote, the United States was never going to help us, Rachmanin said, adding that only limited aid remains, as in intelligence, early warning missile systems, Starlinks and critical ammunition. So according to Mr. Rachmanin, that's not help, that's just limited aid. What would Ukraine do without the early warning missile system? I mean, just imagine that. Because they're saying that the downing rate of the Russian missiles is at around 90%. Well, if that's the case, let's just imagine that number is even remotely close. Who do you have to thank that for? Well, it's certainly not the green t-shirt, it's the United States. They're the ones controlling the damage. This is all about damage control. That's why the United States, even though they're not sending military equipment anymore, they still have left intact all of those early warning systems, the Starlink, the critical ammunition, because the last thing that the United States wants is for the Ukrainian army to completely collapse. That being said, what the United States has done for this conflict, even though they've instigated the conflict themselves, has been tremendous. This has costed the US taxpayers an insane amount of money. And this is not about politics here. This is about the American people who have paid for this, for all of it. But you know, Mr. Rachmanin is saying, well, this is not help, this is just limited aid. Well, say that to the US taxpayers. And also say that to the European taxpayers who are actually putting up with higher energy bills, higher grocery prices, and all of this malarkey for this. It's insane. And here comes the heavyweight. Lithuania's former foreign minister mocks delay in delivery of Taurus missiles to Ukraine and anti-Russian sanctions. And this is, of course, Mr. Landsbergis. Known for his outspoken criticism of Russian aggression against Ukraine, Landsbergis did not hold back his sarcasm. He posted a message on Sunday following a night of extensive Russian airstrikes on Ukrainian cities and villages. Quote, "Hello, sorry to disturb you, but have you heard anything about Taurus and those crippling sanctions? Let me know, thanks," Landsbergis said. This is propaganda in full effect. He's saying it as if Taurus missiles and crippling sanctions would stop Russian missiles. They don't, Mr. Landsbergis. You've been getting to the 17th sanctions package and Russia still launches missiles. Haven't you noticed that maybe this is not one of the most effective tactics? Have you tried diplomacy? I mean, even if they wanted to try diplomacy, I'm afraid even that's impossible, because in order to conduct diplomacy, you need diplomats. And I think they're in very short supply in Europe these days. My friends, I'll end this episode here. Let me know what do you make of that argument? What kind of argument is that? Please let me know in the comments, because according to Mr. Tusk's logic, anybody, anywhere can be accused of treason. Poland and Ukraine are two separate countries with two separate people with two separate kinds of interest. You cannot accuse anybody in Poland of treason because they're not supporting what the green t-shirt wants. It's just backwards. Hello my friends, I hope you're all doing well. Today is Friday, the 23rd of May, and this is my only video update of the day. You're supporting what the green... You cannot accuse anybody in Poland of treason because they're not supporting what the green t-shirt wants. It's just backwards. Hello my friends, I hope you're all doing well. Today is Friday, the 23rd of May, and this is my only video update of the day. You're probably wondering, why does it say masks come off on this video's thumbnail? And that's because, as we are moving towards the end of this conflict, the European leaders are being forced to show their hand and confirm what many of us have suspected for a long time. This was never about Ukraine. What this is about, it's money, power, control, and political relevancy for the EU. This is about the European project that certain EU leaders think it's for the best. Like it or not, want it or not, we are all paying for it. And when I say all of us, I mean all of us in Europe. With that said, let me waffle no more and introduce you to today's video, because it's definitely gonna be one for the ages. I have 6 articles for you, and all of them, but one, are about the G7, the EU, and certain EU leaders who are showing just how desperate they are. And that one article, which is ruining the fun, it's about Vladimir Putin. He's the intruder who's ruining the fun for all the EU leaders. He's crashing the party on Ukrainska Pravda. Speaking of Ukrainska Pravda, let us go straight there to the beacon of democracy and let's check out the G7. G7 on Russian assets. They'll remain frozen until Moscow ends war and compensates Ukraine. Quote, "We reaffirm that, consistent with our respective legal systems, Russia's sovereign assets in our jurisdictions will remain immobilized until Russia ends its aggression and pays for the damage it has caused to Ukraine." So they're saying that the G7 will not give Russia its own money back until it compensates Ukraine for the damages. So you would naturally assume that the Russian frozen assets would end up supporting the Ukrainian people who lost their homes in the war, right? Well, if only that was true. But the plan, I'm afraid, is not that simple. Reality is a little bit different and it stinks. And they're gonna spell it out for us at the very end of this article. Quote, we condemn Russia's continued brutal war against Ukraine and commend the immense resilience from the Ukrainian people and economy. Ukraine has suffered significant destruction. Yes, indeed, Ukraine has suffered significant destruction, but who's actually fueling and encouraging this? Who's actually picking up the microphone daily saying, well, Ukraine must prevail, Russia needs to be pushed out all the way to the 1991 borders and all of that nonsense? Who's saying all of this? Well, I'll leave you on that question. By the way, this conflict never had to reach this far. This conflict could have ended before it even started, and it had a diplomatic solution. But nobody was willing to talk, because there's no profiteering from talk. There's a lot of profiteering, though, from the reconstruction of Ukraine. And this is how I'm gonna slowly move the conversation into the next paragraph, because it's absolutely incredible. Also, I want to say this. They're commending the Ukrainian economy. What economy? For the last 3.5 years, the Ukrainian economy was the EU and the United States. Well, the United States in the Joe Biden era, it must be said. But nowadays, the European Union are filling Joe Biden's shoes just well. Quote, we will continue to coordinate support to promote the early recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine, including at the Ukraine Recovery Conference, which will take place in Rome on the 10th to 11th of July 2025. Further, we agree to work together with Ukraine to ensure that no countries or entities from those countries that financed or supplied the Russian war machine will be eligible to profit from Ukraine's reconstruction. They're actually saying the magic word, profit. They're making no qualms about what this is about. This is about profiting from the reconstruction of Ukraine. And this is what many of us have said since this conflict began. There's gonna be a lot of money to be made, and the way they're gonna shift the conversation is this. Look, we have all those Russian frozen assets, let's say stolen assets. And we're not keeping this for ourselves, of course not. That would not be morally justified. But what we are gonna do, we're gonna give it to Ukraine. That's for the public opinion, right? That's the message for the masses. But in reality, they're the ones who want to control the reconstruction of Ukraine process from start to finish. Basically, they want to ensure that the regime in Kiev will only be favorable towards the European Union. And that's because they plan to send the Western companies, the Western European companies, to reconstruct Ukraine. So by definition, all of that money from the Russian frozen assets would end up in the pockets of the Western oligarchs. How beautiful. Well, my apologies. The West doesn't have oligarchs. It's entrepreneurs and self-made millionaires, right? This is exactly the grift. And also, don't you imagine that those 200 billion worth of frozen Russian assets would last indefinitely? Don't you even think that you can reconstruct all of Ukraine with that money? Of course not. That money will quickly run out, and then it would have to be supplemented somehow. And who do you think will pay the difference? Well, it's the same you and I. You know, the same Ukrainian economy. This is absolutely incredible. But as I said, the more we get closer to the end of this conflict, the more apparent it actually becomes. And they don't stop here. The next article, it's about Kaja Kallas and what she said with regards to Serbia. But before I move there, let me just conclude this last paragraph here. They're saying that they want to block out all of the entities which come from the countries which have supported Russia. What does that mean? Well, I think it means the United States as well, because this is why they're making such a big fuss with regards to Donald Trump liking Vladimir Putin just a little bit too much. Because when the time comes, they will say, well, look, Donald, I am sorry, but you've been a little bit too close to Moscow, so maybe the American companies can't really reconstruct Ukraine. This is why Donald Trump wanted to sign that mineral deal. This is why there's such a big smokescreen, and by the way, we still don't know the truth. I think it will take a long, long time before the smoke clears so we can see exactly what the plan was. But that's the ballpark. Now let's move on to Kaja Kallas. EU chief diplomat in Belgrade urges Serbia to make strategic choice between West and East. And this is a quote from Kallas. From my discussions with the Serbian political leadership, it is clear that the EU membership remains a strategic goal. However, I want to emphasize that we need to see actions also to prove and support those words. Right, so action on the part of Serbia is needed. Well, let's see exactly what sort of action she's talking about. Kallas added that real progress towards EU membership requires tangible steps, including reforms, media freedom, anti-corruption measures, and electoral reform. She also met with participants of protests demanding democratic changes. So let's translate what she's saying. Media freedom, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean what you and I think it means, of course not. This is about giving all the power in Serbia to the Brussels-aligned media, the free media, the pro-Western media. That's what she's talking about. Then she's mentioning electoral reform. Well, what is that? Does this have anything to do with democracy? Well, I'm afraid not. What that means is basically aligning the process, the electoral process in Serbia, to look more like what Romania did in December. If there's suspicion of a pro-Russian or a pro-Chinese or a pro-whatever candidate, well, in that case, certain measures have to be put in place. Why? Because if the result is not the desired one, you need to have a mechanism to be able to reverse all of that and then go and vote again. That's what she really means. And then there's the other one, anti-corruption measures. Well, who would oppose that, you may ask? What's bad about it? Well, I've seen it in action, I've seen it at play in Romania.